Henrik probably thinks he's going to get a chance to take a breath after he's just done a talk, but let's kick things off just kind of staying on that theme that we've just been on. And I hate to be the person who has to play devil's advocate, but what the hell, that's what I'm here for. I'll come out and just like disclaimer, I'm pretty well sold on this. However, I sometimes get into the conversation with people where I'm saying, users aren't going to download this app. We're not going to install it. You're going to lose people every step of the way of the installation. And people sometimes say to me on projects, yeah, but you can't do that yet on the web. And you cited Strava as a good example. Thank you. And so do you think we're there yet? Do you think that we really are at the point that we could start to build out an app like such as Strava in a way that we could effectively deliver it in this way, hand on heart?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think the discovery mechanism is incredible. Having a URL that like drops you into the experience, like as far as a user acquisition perspective, yeah, if you're a huge major brand that already has market share, yeah, people will go look for your app. But like everybody else, like stats seem to show that that's not the case. Being like randomly discovered on an app store is a gamble of the worst kind, in my opinion.
And I'm completely sold on the user acquisition and getting people like into the interaction for the first time. But I'm kind of thinking about the kind of things that an app like, let's just say with Strava for the moment, might have to do. So in terms of its access to different devices and kind of running in the background. And I don't know, maybe Kenneth will chirp up at some point as we're starting to talk about like access to devices. But are those kind of things available to us enough yet?
So I really probably picked the worst possible example of Strava because, as it turns out, background geolocation is not a thing yet, which is exactly what you need to track an app. My point with that was just the fact that it's something that I really do not care where it was before then. So in that particular use case, if you're building a Runkeeper competitor, maybe not, just because there are things. But if I were you, I would still build a web app and use a thin layer on top of it to provide that functionality. I mean, because again, skate where the puck is going. You don't need 3 code bases to build to build an app for a screen of the same size. Like, why? And as from an experience perspective, you can provide as good or better of an experience that loads faster. Like, give me the reason why you would bother spinning up 3 teams to build a startup. Like, I don't get that. So, yeah.
Okay, fair enough. And Kenneth, I mean, since we're just talking a little bit about access to devices, doing things in the background, some of the work that you've done kind of taken you to that point where you're thinking, actually, you know what, this is starting to get viable to unlock the potential in some of these slightly more difficult kind of use cases that we're maybe talking about.
Yeah, I think like our point of view is that we don't see like progressive web apps or web apps taking over everything. Like, you're definitely not going to write your virtual keyboard as a progressive web app. That's not the point. But we're looking at specific like areas. I know as the Chrome team, so maybe like looking at media apps, saying like what is missing for media apps to succeed. So instead of trying to just like randomly pick features, you look, oh, well, they need a way to share articles. Maybe they need to have problems with scrolling, so we need a new API for this. And then they'll move on like to the next field. Like, see, oh, maybe we want to enable like photo apps. So it's about being able to like process a video really quickly. So maybe a WebAssembly could be one of the solutions for that. Better access to the video camera, and like the face detection API, things like that. So.
Yeah. Yep, cool. I mean, so one thing that strikes me in this kind of area is, and I'm really glad, Henrik, that you called out the progressive web apps aren't a Google thing. Yes, they're shouting loud about it, and they didn't even name it. I know that kind of it seems to kind of land on Alex Russell's shoulder a lot, but Francis Berryman, who does not work at Google, kind of is the one that posited it for the first time, that kind of name. But it does feel like they're pushing it really hard, and they're doing a lot of things to embrace it and kind of help it move along. And you mentioned some of the things that are coming to Android now as well. Is there a danger? Should we be, and any of you be at all worried that we're kind of starting to move from one kind of master to another, as we're seeing the flip happen from, okay, well, the darling is iOS and we're building everything as apps, but now we're starting to build things in a certain way that is just for Android. Are we trading one for another? Is anyone worried about that?
I'm not worried about it. I think maybe there's some concern there, but again, like there's no reason you couldn't just wrap it in a native app if you really need some piece of functionality or something from iOS. And in terms of another master, I'm totally okay with the web being the master. And that's the way I see it. You know, as much as possible, building for standards, not doing all these like crazy tweaks for one-off browsers. Like even though some of these things are experimental or kind of early stage, there's still many of them are on a standards track, and they are actively seeking interest from other browsers. Like pick the stuff that is web. You know, if what you're writing involves writing WebKit or writing words like this, maybe that's not the way to go, right? Like, but there's an awful lot of things that are coming to the web as a whole. And again, the more people that are in there using it, building amazing experiences with it, the platforms will come along. I think that's the thing. People always assume that they're powerless as developers. Like in reality, it's the other way around. Like we shouldn't play their game. They have to play ours. Otherwise, we're not going to build stuff for them, right?
And I think the exciting thing for me is that you kind of played on the word progressive there. And for me, the thing that's exciting is that a lot of these technologies, really, they're kind of built with progressive enhancement, right? So we're ready to build these things now, and then the platforms can come along. Una, do you have something?
Yeah. I feel like people all the time talk about browser inconsistencies with PWAs, and specifically like with Google and like Chrome versus Safari. But we forget that when you talk about native applications, we're talking about Java and Swift. Those are very different things. So I think that even when you talk about inconsistencies, it's just so much more of a shared language among the web, even if there is a tweak here and there, if things work differently, if something's not implemented yet. And I'm a big fan of like just don't repeat yourself. So, like you were saying, if you don't have to build 3 teams, you're going to be able to get your product out there in the world much more effectively and efficiently.
Yeah, I could not agree more. I kind of want to switch tack a tiny bit and talk about some slightly different things. I was really taken with some of the content of, and Jessica, in your talk, when you're talking about how quickly you're able to get some of these tools and these projects of yours out into the world and kind of making things that are valuable to people. And it felt like there's a couple of themes that I kind of picked up from your talk and from Una's talk about kind of the polish of things and things being perfect versus things being useful and ready to use. I always find that there's a kind of a tension there. So how have you been able to kind of embrace that and kind of just say, okay, well, you know what, done is better than perfect. We need to ship this. Has that been a hard thing to get to? Have you worked places where that's been embraced more than others?
Yeah, I mean, it also depends on, so a lot of this stuff is personal projects, right, which there's less of a need for it to be perfect and polished. And so certainly there I have embraced it. And I think early on when I started developing, the people around me encouraged me to just put everything on GitHub and get over that fear. And so I really did.
Yeah. But I think that's quite a hard thing to do quite often, right? And I think that's one of the lovely side effects from working with open source projects is that you kind of have to get to the point that you're comfortable sharing something that might not be absolutely perfect just yet, but it's quite a hard thing to get to. And the reason I mentioned your talk in thinking about that is because the kind of diagrams that you were demonstrating were kind of hand-drawn, illustrated. They convey so much in such a simple kind of playful way. I work at an agency where we like to make a deck, we like to make some slides about stuff, and just because it's polished and has had a design team working on it doesn't mean that it's any more accurate or relevant than something that has been done quickly. So I really like that. So I mean, do you think that can really convey more information and actually can always be credible at every kind of way that it's being used?
Yeah, so I think that one of the most productive things that I've done is decided not to be a perfectionist. I think that I wouldn't ship or share half the things I do if I was waiting on myself to go back and polish it and make sure it's all accurate and do some additional research. If it's wrong, somebody on the internet will let you know. Thing I learned, just trust me. So I did one of these dev doodles and I shared it on Twitter and somebody was like, well, actually, but then I was able to go back and fix it and it's fine. I wouldn't have built it and shared it if I was worried about it being perfect every single time. That's just, it's really counterproductive to, I think, working on the web.
Right. And I asked Eric earlier on about the culture of good documentation. So we've kind of asked you about that a little bit, but I kind of wanted to open that up a little bit more as well, and particularly thinking like into some of the work that you're doing, like working on design systems and all of that, those kind of things. Do you have any different experiences in like trying to embed like this culture of beautiful documentation, like making that part of what we do rather than an afterthought?
I would like 2 more. I think that people always appreciate it when you do have really nice documentation. And specifically with design systems, the copy is becoming more and more of an important part of what we're shipping. I don't really work on the design side of it. I work on the technical and architectural side of it. So I don't have to deal with this as much, but I know that a big part of what the designers are dealing with is how do we convey usage and how do we convey the rules around that. And I think that this kind of has a parallel to, like in the technical world, APIs. And there's a lot of sort of tech there that you have to explain usage for and endpoints and how things work together. So when you do have some kind of like, in my talk, I talked about visualizations, when you have some kind of visual or some kind of diagram that can really help with that specific thing.
Mm-hmm. I tell you what, I'm like a massive sucker for a nice README. So the point that you showed I can't remember what it was called. It was the ASCII flow. ASCII flow, the one just before you skillfully manipulated the audience to give you a round of applause, which, by the way, I'm going to be trying to find a way to do in every talk from now on. I think before they kind of everyone kind of read through that, I think there was already a little murmur in the room. It's like, oh, that's how I can use this and get this in here. So straight away, I was kind of starting to see a benefit from that. So there's also some conversation about kind of bringing tools and processes closer to the users, closer to the people who are consuming them. I think we're talking about some of the tools like spreadsheets that people are comfortable with already, but some people don't kind of assume that that's going to be a fitting tool in like a software engineering project. I don't agree with that. I think get people using the tools they're comfortable with, but is that hard to get people to do sometimes? I mean, I think we've probably all had examples of that in some shape or form, but Jessica, I mean, how's your experience been on that? Has that been an easy fight to win?
Well, I guess to me, I mean, there's such a broad range of what software is and what types of problems you're building or solving. And, there's the company level, right? A company that has a massive product that ships to millions of people, and that's not probably right for spreadsheets. But there's so many things in between that I think that you can use a spreadsheet for, and that it's a really great tool to get someone into thinking about data and using data. And there's just tons of stuff you can do in the community space, community building, and conferences and schedules and meetups, and there are all these other problems that we have still in our tech space that a spreadsheet absolutely works for. So it's not necessarily, I think, like convincing somebody to start their company and start with a spreadsheet, but that there are things we may not even approach doing or think doing because we're like, oh, there's all this setup, and then how am I want to work with this person, but they use this database and I use this database, and how are we gonna work together? And there's all this space in the middle that I think a spreadsheet will work great for.
Yeah, right. And I've seen real success in just kind of getting people just to use, like, editing a text file in Markdown, right? I kind of rant about content management systems and those kind of things because I like the sexy subjects, And like I've seen like people who are expecting to be able to use like a really complex tool that's bespoke and ready for them, actually being just won over by being able to edit Markdown and then see how it looks. And there are tools that exist for that kind of thing. So I'm like just a big fan of getting to things where people are already quite comfortable. So I'm totally with you on that. I really think that we could do better with specs. Like specs are dry, aren't they? How can we bring some of this stuff to like big, dry technical specs? Some of us around the room are better at reading and comprehending those and contributing and writing those. Do you think that the way specs look are a function of the kind of people who are contributing, or is that just because they have to be something different? Kenneth?
I do think that specs have to be different because it have to be kind of like formal language because it's something you can actually implement.
Yeah.
We are trying to document like how things work by doing something like the web platform tests, where people can actually see this is actually how it implements, and then make sure that that actually is reflected in the spec itself. What we are doing today is that, for instance, like every new spec out of Microsoft and Google has to go through what is called the Web Incubator Working Group. And that's like, there's something called Discourse, I don't remember the URL, where people can go suggest new ideas. Every Googler, when they come up with a new idea, they have to go through that system. It's out there. Then they'll publish a mini spec with an explainer in Markdown, so just for you.
Yay.
And people can go there on GitHub, they can add issues, they can do comments, and then at that point, it will become like an unofficial spec. Later, it will turn into like a working group, depending on what kind of spec it is, and it'll become like a formal text. But like, I was talking about like sensors, and I said like when I started looking at sensors and helping my teammates, I found it was really, really difficult to understand. And there was like, I was looking for books on Amazon, I was like, can't I just like buy a book explaining me how does all these sensors work, and how do you combine them, and how do you do like amazing stuff? And I was like, nothing like that. So I ended up doing like a note. It's like a spec text, but it's like an explainer. And that's why we now have the motion sensor explainer, which kind of like gives us all this kind of background. But I would definitely love like maybe like other people from the community, if they see specs, if they can help doing like doodles and something that, of course, it has to be formal in a way, or we can get that into specs and make them like more readable. That will be really awesome. And I would love people to do that.
Yeah, I mean, as you say, it's communicating something that's quite formal, but that doesn't mean that the means of communicating it shouldn't be the most effective thing, right?
Right.
I recall a project I worked on where the experience designer, we've been used to kind of creating very formal documents about that, but the XD had put the structure of this site in Post-its on a whiteboard, and we'd sketched on it, and then we took a picture of it and put that in a document, and my life was changed because I'm used to kind of creating something that's much drier than that, and then I think you consume it differently. I think the way that you, as you were talking about, the way that you consume that is quite different. But I even think that the course of writing something helps you understand it, right? Is that also something that's kind of valuable? The way that when you draw something, then you comprehend it as you're doing it.
Yeah, so I think like the act of also diagramming and visually representing something does help you and other people understand it. And about the specs, I will say specifically, I definitely follow the CSS specs. And a lot of them do have visualizations because you have to have like an example. To me, specs ideally are tests, and they kind of show you what the expected outcome is, and then they describe that expected outcome. But I do think that having diagrams about how to get from point A to point B can help people understand, especially implementers, how the process is going to work. So I think that, yes, specs do have to be formal. They have to have all of the technical information and content for how something is implemented, but that can also be presented in a form that is visual.
Right. I'm going to just change tack again a tiny bit onto a slightly different subject. So Eric, I was really kind of thinking when you were talking about how you'd kind of changed the approach and changed what you were pushing for after you'd started building a native application, and the way that kind of like pivoted a little bit. Forgive me for using that term. But is it hard to give up or admit defeat or decide that actually we're digging in the wrong place? And when you've invested so much effort in something, because I think collectively, there are lots of people who are building applications in a certain way, or they've decided to build an application, and once you've kind of committed a certain amount to that, it can be hard to change. So how did you kind of tackle that at MailChimp?
Yeah, it definitely can be hard, especially for the engineers who've spent a considerable amount of time working on it. It can be really tough. But if you're listening to your users and they're saying this thing doesn't work, then you have to listen to them there. And it's all about the culture of your company. So for us, that culture starts at the very top. I use listen hard, change fast, and that's invented by our CEO. He came up with that term. He came up with why it's important. Mm-hmm. And so it goes from him down to everyone. And in that case, we just did what we do as a company. And we say that, we're okay with failure, and then we prove it by, building an editor that just didn't work. And I don't think it's because the person didn't do a great job. He did a great job. It just wasn't the right project in the right format.
Yeah, I think it's just hard to come to that realization, right? Because we've all heard this kind of expression of kind of failing fast, but it's hard sometimes to decide. Okay, let's draw a line under it, right?
Yeah, I think it's rare to fail fast. I think you usually fail like pretty slow. I think that you might launch something that fails. You might launch something fast that ends up failing,
yep.
But it doesn't fail fast. It takes it a while to fail, and you you probably try to make it a success over and over and over. But you have to get to a point where you can realize that, no, this thing is failing and we need to shift gears.
And I think so. Another real advantage of like the model of publishing things over the web as opposed to an application can be the rate of being able to publish changes and the rate of kind of getting things out into the wild. But even then, that's not a given, right? I mean, I've certainly worked on enough of projects of my own where we've sucked at getting things out quickly. You know, it's definitely easy to screw that up if you're not careful. Is that something that you've spent a lot of time kind of optimizing at MailChimp, being able to deploy things quickly and then step things back and do something different?
Yes, definitely. To answer the question earlier, you know, done is better than perfect, and especially on the web because you can iterate very quickly. But you have to have tooling and process around being able to do that very quickly, especially if you're at a company of decent size. Mm-hmm. And you know, you start to hit that size where your entire team's probably not going to be in a room together, or be able to know that if I make a change, how it's going to affect the change that she wrote or that he wrote. So you have to have some process around it. And I think that the biggest part for us is two things. One, feature flags are phenomenal, super, super helpful. They've been really, really helpful for us to be able to slow roll things out. You hit it to 1% of users and watch as that happens and make adjustments along the way. And the other thing is our QA process is that we test like users, not like testers, the thing I talked about earlier today. We actually test in production a lot. So the first feature flag is to internal users, but it's in production. And we can roll it out super quickly and roll it back super quickly in case we've broken something. But our QA team tests live in production.
Is that expression something that puts fear into people the first time they hear it? We test in production? Because it makes perfect sense what you're describing, but as a phrase, holy cow, that's scary.
Yeah, it's like I don't test, but when I do, it's in production. The memes that go around, we're like, yes, that's what we do. It is fairly tough. We actually had conversations recently where we decided to decommission all of our staging servers and just use production.
Really?
And it's just the case that staging, if you're not really, really, really using it and it's not hitting any sort of production load, it's just going to always be behind and not be production. And that's what you really want to test in. So it is a little pew pew. You only live once, but so far it's working fairly well.
That terrifies me. I wouldn't want to be in the 1% that you crash.
Jessica, I kind of gathered that the life at GitHub was a bit similar to that in terms of kind of getting things out to people. Is that fair?
Yeah. So I worked on .com stuff for a while in my first year and a half there, and that was totally just deploy your branch to production. Things have changed a lot. In my last 2 years there, I was on Atom and Electron stuff, which is different because it's a desktop app, so I don't have any of those worries.
Right.
I mean, you test and test and test, and when everything passes, you can ship a build. Or you can work with the auto update with Electron and that kind of stuff. So it's a whole different world when you're creating a desktop app.
Fair enough. Okay, fair enough. So I'm going to just turn to a couple of questions from Twitter, if that's okay. So Soon is asking about web components. We've talked over the last couple of days about a couple of different frameworks, and React's been mentioned, Angular's been mentioned, and Soon is asking, will web components eventually win over these massive JavaScript frameworks? Does anyone have any thoughts on that? Kenneth, do you want to start with that?
I believe they will. It's the standard. I think a lot of people. It took a while to get there, and we needed other browsers on board. I think that Apple implemented it. I think that Mozilla and Microsoft are on board. They said that they need to do some changes in the implementation, so it'll take a while, but eventually it will get there. They're pretty good polyfills. They're even small polyfills. And you can use it today. So actually one of the good examples we have seen recently is Ionic. You might know Ionic. They do this it's based on Angular. It's kind of like a framework where they have existing components for everything. So it really helps you making native looking apps using web technologies, using hybrid apps. So you just use their buttons. They look like an iOS button on iOS, a Windows one on Windows, and an Android one on Android. And then you can build it up and wrap it up as a Cordova app. But they were just as like Henrik, they were super excited about this progressive web apps and said we're a web company. But when they tried to push it on the web with Angular, they were looking at this called Lighthouse score, and well, they weren't doing very well. And they said, we need to do something different. Like, we cannot ship like 1.5 megabyte down to our users. This is not good enough. So they took a new look at web components and built like a small compiler around it, because like their users were getting, and themselves were getting used to use like TypeScript. They really loved it. And so can we use like all these things we use today, just compile it down to a web component and ship it? Then it will work like everywhere. And they did that. And they wrote this compiler called Stencil, which was announced here in Copenhagen at the Polymer Summit. And like their apps are like, they were talking about like 6 to 8 times faster. They're smaller, and they think, like, if you just look at the CEO on his Twitter account, he's like every day tweeting something like, "This is the future. I have seen the light. This is super awesome." So I think that like when big companies like Ionic start adopting these companies, it's no longer just this like nice thing to have that we might have in the future. We also have Lars downstairs showing this like the resuscitation doll. And like one of the developers in the company where he was like consulting, she spent like, I think like 2 weeks learning JavaScript and did like that whole game you see there using Polymer.
Really?
And the thing is that instead of like when you get thrown into a big framework where everyone is working on the same, everything is intertangled, it becomes some kind of spaghetti, or it's easy to make it into some kind of spaghetti. Here, like people can concentrate on making these like small components. They have very simple APIs, like, oh, you take in attributes, you send out events, and it's kind of like easy to understand and grasp. And also, like their success with Polymer was that, like, well, if you don't understand anything, well, you just open up that like file and you see exactly what is happening. And with other toolkits, they're like so huge and so big, and there's so much magic going on. And I really don't like magic. I really like understanding like how things work. So I think that we'll definitely see more and more people trying to work with the web components and having great success doing so.
Okay, Henrik, have you got anything on that?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, I'm talking with the Stencil folks next week. I've got a meeting scheduled that they wanted to chat about something. But yeah, I think there's huge potential, especially in this whole idea of compiling 2 web components. I think it's really fascinating. There's another framework I don't know what to call it, a tool called Svelte that just announced that they're doing the same thing. And the kind of universal aspect of web components is really fascinating, especially for, a lot of companies put together these style guides or, UI pattern libraries. And like having a set of basically pre-branded just components that you can, that any team in your company can just drop in and use, like that's magic. I don't see how that could fail. I mean, I think what ended up happening is I think Google botched this in the beginning. They confused everybody. They taught everybody what Polymer was, and they're like, what's this web component thing? I think the marketing messages initially were just horrid, in my opinion, because you got in there and you say, oh, I'm going to use Polymer components for everything now. But I think that somehow in the shuffle there, that the neat aspects of web components kind of got lost. I think now, in their later releases of this stuff, you start to see that web components actually shine through. And as it turns out, you don't need to use Polymer to use web components. Surprise. I think there's a tremendous amount of potential. I'm still questioning, like, and by the way, YouTube, the new YouTube.com, all Polymer web components. Like, you view the DOM tree that it creates, beautiful. It's just a bunch of components. So yeah, and I mean, YouTube is what, the second largest trafficked site in the entire web, I think. Like, this is no joke. Like, it's not will it happen, like, it's happening. So,
okay,
interesting to watch, for sure.
Good stuff. There's another question from Twitter as well, and since we're talking about, what can websites do or web apps do that maybe apps can't, or vice versa, and that's about billing. So Marion asked on Twitter, what about billing as a model on the web? Billing's easy via app stores, but how about through the web?
Yeah, so there's actually a lot of things going on with billing on the web. One of the problems is it's never been a big issue on desktop, because you have mouse and keyboard, and people are pretty efficient at writing using a keyboard. But on mobile, it's like you get like people, they just transfer the same forms into like a mobile interface, and you have to scroll like, I don't know how many pages and type thing, you type in the wrong thing. Sometimes it's not even the auto completion, and people, they just give up. Like, this is not the experience that people, they want. So people have been working on web payments, where the browser will actually know like where you live, where you regularly ship things to, and calculate the price and all of that. So it's like really nicely integrated. But the problem is that in the future, like, or probably like in the US, it's fine. Maybe every shop will support like Apple Pay and Android Pay, but I definitely don't see that happening here in Denmark. Like the banks or Apple have announced like we'll get like Apple Pay in Denmark, but the banks say, yeah, for Americans, for people traveling here who come from a country where the banks actually support it, don't believe that the Danish banks will support it, because we have our own credit card called Dancard. We pay like 10 cents or something like that per transaction and no extra fee, no percentage on top of it. People are not going to pay more for something to use like Apple Pay. And the banks don't want it. So like Google, they actually realized this, and they spend a lot of time in like allowing people to create like these payment apps, like both like web apps, but also like native apps, because sometimes you need some specific native APIs to make it really secure. So they're enabling that on the web. And I think that's like super exciting. It will take a while for like people, companies to actually realize the potential and start using it. But when they do, it's going to change the whole world, I think.
Yeah, I thought that's really exciting as well. The Web Payments API, I think I saw a demonstration of that at the Chrome Dev Summit in November, and just seeing like seamless payments of the credit card details that you had stored already.
And the amount of UI that you don't have to build.
Yeah. Exactly, yeah. The fact that you don't have to worry about, and that it can be, again, a progressive enhancement. So it's not a question of, I'll do it this way or the other way. It's like, well, you just add it to the way that you're currently doing it, and you kind of get that.
When the companies, they realize that they're actually getting like more users buying stuff, like you'll see major adoption.
Yeah, good stuff. So we're almost out of time. I had a question. I've seen a couple of comments on Twitter, and this actually chimes with something that resonates with me. And this is taking it back to sketching. And so this might go to, there might be other people who kind of chime in on this as well. So I love sketching. I love doodling. I'm poor at it, I think, is the way to express that. We've already seen like some amazing sketch notes like from this conference, and that's what I aspire to do. And then I look at what I've done, and it's not quite that. Has anyone? So maybe you could start with this. But has anyone got any tips on how to get better at sketching? Not a fair pivot from talking about Payments API, but how do I get better at sketching? This is for me, actually. No one asked. It's me.
We don't all have to be like super talented at drawing. Like, I think Brian's an awesome drawer. I'm not as good as Brian. I never will be, and that's okay.
Yeah.
A lot of sketching is arrows, boxes, circles, dashes, dotted lines. I think that we can all do that, right? No. But the other thing about sketchnoting is also just adding like a touch of color. Like you can go and like get really light colored markers and just like highlight something, or even on your tablet, make text bigger and smaller in certain places, chunking content. So if there's like a talk that has 3 different sections, you can just make boxes and have the content inside of that. If any of that like relates to something else, you can like draw a little arrow. Links, maybe you have like a red pen. You want to write your links in red so that they stand out, so you know what to go and look at. Like next steps, like action items. After this talk, I want to go and check out the Web Payments API. I want to go learn about companies utilizing it or trying to. I want to learn about like what the spec looks like right now. So that's kind of like how to start breaking things up.
Great, and I'm just finding just lots of inspiration from looking what other people have done, and just trying some of the conventions I'm seeing. Right, Eric, it looks like you're about to chime in.
Yeah,
Closet doodler.
I am a horrible artist. I am absolutely just terrible, and I have decided to start doodling as actually some stress relief. And I started it by buying a book that was like how to draw. And there's a pretty famous meme out there about drawing an owl. And the book was exactly that. Yeah. It was draw 2 circles and then draw the rest of the fucking owl. And it was impossible. And so I got super frustrated and actually just brought my phone out and just brought the keyboard up and typed in a bunch of emojis and then just started sketching the emojis. And so that's what I do now. I just go 1 page at a time. I'll grab like the rocket ship and the airplane emoji and just work on getting pretty good at those.
Just love the fact that you're documenting by hand every emoji.
Yeah.
Like,
I have a notebook now.
You should share that.
It'll be preserved for history.
Yeah.
But now I can, now if I need to do some sort of doodling, emojis pretty much cover life. So I can draw just about anything now
There's
that I
no
need to care
taco
about.
yet.
There's no taco?
There's no taco
There's no
emoji.
taco? Well, other than that,
Really?
that's really important. Someone has to
Tacos
fix
are
that.
life. So.
How have we got through 2 days of talks and discussions without addressing this? Holy cow, this is wow. Okay, awesome. So I think I'm going to wrap things up. I think we're going to draw things to a close. I just want to call back to one thing that Henrik mentioned. He was actually quoting Alex Russell when he was talking about progressive web apps being websites that took all the right vitamins. I love that quote, and I think it's nice because this isn't a question of progressive web apps or other things. When we're building anything for the web or anything, it's important that they all take the right vitamins. So I kind of like that quote. I think, please, can you just join me in thanking all of the speakers today who've joined us on the panel? So big thanks to all of you. Thank you.